Hello, and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law. As the Digest looks at regional neighbors impacted by the Iran war, I'm very happy to have Aslı Aydıntaşbaş back on the podcast. Aslı is a fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where she's the director of the Turkey Project. She's also a senior associate fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Aslı, good to have you back on the podcast.
Good to be here, Bill.
Now, it would appear the Trump administration made the wrong assumption, assassinate Iran's senior leadership, and the regime would collapse. In the early hours of the war, the Ayatollah, senior IRGC, military security people, they're all killed. Now, here we are, more than a week on. The regime is still standing, and considering the extent of the damage that the U.S. and Israeli bombing is inflicting upon it, it's fighting back pretty effectively, I would say. Turkey has adopted a neutral stance. How effective has that stance been, and can it be maintained, Aslı?
Well, Bill, yes, we're in week 2 of this war. And as you've noted, the Trump administration has had shifting goals. Before I get to Turkey, let me briefly talk about how this has been a moving goalpost from the beginning. As someone who lives in Washington, we've seen President Trump, first of all, really struggle to define the reasons for going to war, and then really struggle to define the end game. If there is anything about this moment, it is definitely been confusion also for Washington and for anyone inside the US government watching what the United States is trying to achieve. Sometimes President Trump saying different things to different reporters throughout the course of a day, starting off with a very clear signal that his intention is regime change. As you've said, the regime has been far more resilient and is not collapsing. So then moving on to a situation in which sounded very much that he was open to a Venezuela type of deal with the existing regime, with the remnants of the regime. And now, yesterday, Marco Rubio coming out and saying that redefining US goals as one, to destroy the ability of the regime to launch missiles and launch and destroy the launchers and destroy factories that make the missiles. So, but also wondering if the US is essentially at this point going for a regime collapse or state collapse of some sort. So Turkey, obviously a country next door, has had a really difficult time managing it. Never wanted this war to start. Turks had been playing a leading role in the negotiations in the run-up to the war, actually talking to Arakci, one of their nuclear negotiators, and Iran's foreign minister, talking to others, but more importantly, using its access to the Trump administration to make a case for diplomacy. Through not just Trump, but Witkoff and Jared Kushner and so on. It wasn't too long ago that there were nuclear negotiations between President Trump's envoys and Iranian government. I think once war became inevitable, Turkey tried to stay out of it, not taking the position that Gulf Arab states have taken, which were very much, of course, saying they won't be part of it, but more supportive of the US posture, in part because they're more reliant on the United States for their defense. Turkey tried to play a neutral role, balancing act of sorts, was very cautious on the language it used towards Iran, not condemning it. In fact, it's gone over the board condemning President Erdoğan condemning the death of Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. I would say that Turkey's position was very much fearing an instability, the fallout from the war, not at all thinking that regime change was a possibility, that it clearly Turkish leaders assumed that regime might be more resilient, and they prepared for themselves for a long-term instability.
So in the week and a half since the war commenced, what are Turkey's prime objectives?
Turkey's primary objectives seem to be prevention of mass migration to its borders, something they had seen and suffered from in many ways in the war in Syria, previously in the Gulf War, of course. But also, I think Ankara obviously fears Kurdish angle and
Yeah,
the emergence of an independent Kurdish state
I
on
want to get
Iran.
into that. I want to get into that with you, Asla, and we will get there. Uh, but I also wanted to pick up on something you've already touched on. Andreas Krieg in our podcast last week discussed, which is that, as you said, and he said, that the U.S. Trump had no strategy going in. They have no exit strategy. They apparently do not even have, or maybe they're starting to develop some exit ramps. We'll see on that one. But the Israelis have a strategy, and Andreas called it the strategy of chaos. You don't look for a quick win. You draw out the war. You bleed your enemies, and the longer it takes, the better. You don't trouble yourself about civilian casualties or international law. You just keep blasting away. And of course, the Israelis have now extended the war into Lebanon. Chaos is following there, with more than 1 million already displaced in that country. So, do you think this is a strategy that Israel can win with? And what are the implications for Ankara if Israel does succeed in this strategy?
I think you and I spoke about Turkish-Israeli rivalry and how it's basically turned into a strategic enmity at this point, not just over Syria and over influence over Syria, but Eastern Mediterranean. It's definitely spilled into Horn of Africa with the whole debate on Somaliland and so on. I think Iran was a very dangerous gambit for Turkey because Ankara did not want to see the emergence of a pro-Israeli new Iran. It didn't think that was likely, but it was very much opposed to the Trump administration's policy of going along with Israel's security priorities. For the longest time, I think Turks thought that there was a divergence between US goals and Israeli goals, that Americans wanted a quick operation, something that would wrap up in 4 or 5 days, whereas Israelis wanted an open-ended thing. Whether there was a distinction or not, Bill, it seems to be irrelevant at this point, in the sense that at the end of the day, President Trump, like President Biden has, tends to go along with Israeli strategy, and we have yet to see him step in to put a difference or divergence between his position and Israel's position. So I think that is absolutely worrisome to Turkey. They started understanding Israel's policy of mowing the lawn, keeping a military dominance over its neighbors, to be something that is extremely destabilizing for Syria, for Lebanon, of course, and now for Iran. But more importantly, I think there's a very clear sense in Turkey, whether we agree with this or not, but there's a very clear sense that's articulated by officials and very much in the public sentiment among the Turkish people, that Israel will come after Turkey next. And you may think this is a fantasy, but I have to say, Israeli officials lining up to say Turkey is a bigger threat than Iran is not helping. And therefore, I think Turks look at what's happening in Iran. They worry about Israel's hegemonic new role. They worry about Israel's policy of mowing the lawn, as expressed by Israeli officials, keeping their neighbors militarily suppressed using air dominance. And I think that they worry about essentially a future confrontation, given Turkey's own vulnerabilities when it comes to air defense systems and air power, something that Israel has and Turkey lacks. So this is also being seen by Turks through the prism of the Israeli dominance.
Do you think that that strategy that Israel is conducting is in the end going to work for the Israelis?
Well, there's two things I think Israelis are miscalculating. One is they think regional instability is essentially something that will pay off in the long run, that if they keep their neighbors divided and unstable and weak, they can buy time. I think that's a very risky strategy. Leave aside the moral flaws of all this. I just think it doesn't even help them with their Abraham Accords and strategy of improving relations with the Gulf state. We've seen this in Gaza, how Saudis were not able to move forward with normalization with Israel once it became clear that Gaza was the kind of mess and the horrific humanitarian tragedy it was. So I don't think that regional instability is good for Israel is a reasonable proposition. The second thing is something that you keep hearing in Israeli national security circles, particularly with those close to this government, that Turkey's, in the long run, Turkey is a bigger threat than Iran. Well, I don't understand what that is based on. Turkey has been supportive of Palestinians and Palestinian rights, and even Erdoğan has supported Hamas in his speeches, but Turkey has never encouraged acts of terrorism or given weapons to Hamas. There's nobody who can claim that was the case. So that, as such, it's very different from Iran. And Turkey is also a country that has had on and on again, off again, with a good relationship with Israel going back decades. It's the first Muslim nation to have a strategic relationship with Israel, a military alliance with Israel in the past. And the spats that Turks and Israelis have had have largely been about the Palestinian issue. And then they would go back to normalization. Even Erdoğan and Netanyahu shook hands right before October 7, exactly in September 2023, at the UN General Assembly. So I don't think this is a structural difference. The difference is the dispute is largely about Palestinians. And yes, Turkey is run by Islamists, but they're not Islamists that want to blow things up in Tel Aviv or Paris. So this reductionist view that Turkey is seeking an overall, sort of destruction of Israel is, to me, sounds crazy.
Mm.
But you do have a group of people in Turkey in power that do want regional influence. That is true. And you do have a group of people in power in Israel that do want greater Israel. Not everyone in Israeli government, but many people, as we're seeing from the official statements. So that the greater Israel people and the neo-Ottomanist people are in for a clash, Bill.
Okay.
And that's not good.
That is not good. No, no, as if we didn't have enough already. But you talked about this, and I'm going to get back to it because I promised I would. Trump had floated the idea of a proxy war, that is, arm Iranian Kurdish irregulars who are now in Iraqi Kurdistan and send them into Iran to get the job done, so to speak. Now, it seems that Trump is cooling on that idea, but I wonder what President Erdogan must have thought about that.
Well, obviously, this is something that flipped Turkey out, it seems. I've been to that part of the world. It is gorgeous, beautiful, particularly the mountainous region of Iraqi Kurdistan. When I was a journalist, I had a chance to interview some of these groups. And of course, you have over there not just Iraqi Kurdish leadership, but also PKK camps, Kurdistan Workers' Party, but also Iranian Kurdish groups who've had an interesting relationship with the Iranian regime. There has been some sort of a modus vivendi over the past more than a decade, actually, of a ceasefire, live and let live kind of a situation. And the most dominant group over there is PEJAK, the offshoot of the PKK, which obviously complicates things for Turkey, even though they have a peace process with the PKK. That's not really been moving forward. It's not really, and I think Turks worried about the emergence of an autonomous Kurdish region inside Iran. They fear the idea of a greater Kurdistan, where you would see eventually the unification of the four regions where Kurds live: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, of course, where the majority of Kurdish population live. And so any movement towards autonomy or self-rule is seen as a threat. Now, we can, obviously, this is not a very democratic position. Turks should be able to imagine a different future with Kurds. And actually, I have long argued inside Turkey as well that Turkey should be the guardian of Kurds in its own region, even if it means experiments like Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq, which has a good relationship with Turkey. Turkey should devise a way of living with Kurdish entities in its neighborhood, and internally it should also consider, more of a strengthened local governance for Kurds inside Turkey. But that is, of course, a bit of a fantasy at this moment, given Turkey's own democratic backsliding and inability to really move forward on the Kurdish peace process. So what does that leave us? I think the President Trump's idea of arming Kurdish groups, this was in part an Israeli plan. Israelis have long thought of Kurds as their natural allies in the region. They have good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, but it was a risky gamble. We've seen Kurds being used and instrumentalized by the US, going back to not the 90s, Bill, but even the 80s. This goes back to the 70s with Kissinger abandoning Kurds, with Algiers Accords, and basically allowing Saddam Hussein to move in against Kurds. We've seen Bill Clinton, during the Clinton presidency, Kurds were instrumentalized in arms, and only to have the US administration pull the plug and have Kurds having to flee at the time. And again, as late as January 2026, United States actually pretty much abandoned Kurds when the Syrian government moved in order to reclaim some of the territory that was Arab majority from SDF, a group that was fully armed and trained by United States. So I think that Iranian Kurds understand this. More importantly, Iraqi Kurds, Barzani and Talabani families understand this, the two dominant groups in that part of the world. So they've been cautious, asking the US for security guarantees. And meanwhile, Turks were working the phone, urging the Trump administration not to follow this path. And so the plan ended up being abandoned in no less than 72 hours. Is that essentially, has Trump truly ruled it out? Might somebody seeking for a new idea reach out for the sort of dusty shelves at the back at the Pentagon and see if the plan for Syria works in Iran? Would they be tempted to try again in a couple of months? We will see. It may well be the case. But I think President Trump, under pressure from Turkey, but also seeing that Iraqi Kurds are ambivalent and are not really pushing forward with this plan, seems to have abandoned it for now.
Yeah,
I think the fear was that, United States would try this, but the regime, which is not able to truly fight back against the US, but still has ample power to suppress its own people, that the Kurds would be massacred under a regime offensive.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think you're right. Probably whoever gets Trump last and gets in his ear will plant one idea or another. So we'll wait to see on that one. I also think you're right that had the Kurds gone in, they would most likely have been massacred by the IRGC. And I just want to remind our listeners that you're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and in Washington, D.C., the Brookings Institution's Aslı Aydıntaşbaş. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Sign up and you'll receive the first 2 months for free. That's arabdigest.org. You also touched on the refugee situation, and Turkey is quite concerned about that because, as you said, there's a shared border. Turkey took in millions of Syrians during that country's civil war, and you have, the Israeli war and the U.S.-Israeli war is careening the region towards instability, towards chaos. I mean, that's got to be a concern for Ankara because also you've got the economy. The world economy is vulnerable. Strait of Hormuz, and that affects all of us, but it certainly affects Turkey and Turkey's economy as well, doesn't it?
Huge concern, Bill. Economic disruption, trade disruption, refugee inflows. At the end of the day, United States does not have to care about these. So President Trump could even pursue a policy of regime collapse and just sort of work on it for a couple of months and then leave. Can afford to. Not Turkey. I think Turkey and other regional countries are there to pick up the pieces, to bear the consequences of this war. And it's not just refugee flows, but the oil prices and regional instability, continued civil war in Iran, the Kurdish issue, the potential collapse of the peace process in Turkey. There's all sorts of ways that Turkey could be very negatively affected. Not to mention, of course, Iranian missiles that are entering the Turkish airspace. Iranians have not targeted Turkey in the initial round, but it's hard to say who's calling the shots right now.
Yeah, the IRGC and the Army command structure is very, very hard hit.
It's hard to know how the command structure is evolving. That seems to be very much decentralized, and there has been missiles entering Turkish airspace, not just randomly or by accident, targeting U.S. bases. One in Adana, in Incirlik. There's a NATO base, and as of this week, there was an Iranian attempt at targeting major radar base in central Anatolia, Kürecik. So this is very much the moment Turks feared. They don't have adequate amount of air defense or interceptors.
Why is that, Aslı?
Why? Because of the tumultuous relationship with successive U.S. administrations and Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy, its decision to buy a missile defense system from Russia back in 2019, all leading to U.S. sanctions. Therefore, this war has caught Turkey at a moment when it is absolutely vulnerable in terms of air defense, far more so than Saudi Arabia is today. So I think they're going to be scrambling either to improve relations with United States and pivot back to NATO, which I think is the direction they will go, or try to strike a deal with Iran. I mean, obviously they can't really do a full NATO pivot. They will still try to send messages to Iran. I think Erdoğan tried to call Pezeshkian yesterday in order to urge them not to. But is Pezeshkian Iranian leader right now? Is he actually the Iranian leader?
Yeah.
Is he actually calling the shots? I doubt it.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
It's a very hairy situation for Turkey.
Yeah, very hairy and hairy for all of us because we don't really know who's in charge in Iran. And you look at Donald Trump, you think, my God, he's all over the place with the situation. The only ones that seem to have clarity, and it's a ruthless and brutal clarity, are the Israelis. Very worrying. Let me ask you about Russia because it's been reported that the Russians have supplied coordinates of U.S. military targets in the region to Iran. And Erdogan and Putin have, what we call it, a complicated relationship, let's put it that way. So can Ankara play a role in tamping down the flames of war by urging restraint on Putin and others who may be tempted to throw in their lot either with Iran or with Israel and the U.S.? Is there a role there for Turkey?
Bill, I don't think Americans need Turkey to talk to Putin. Not anymore. There was a time during which Turkey played a key role in these negotiations, working its existing channels to Kremlin. But at this point, President Trump picks up the phone and calls Putin or vice versa. So they can negotiate. And we know that Witkoff has talked to Putin. I think there will be a price that Putin will extract for stopping its support for Iran. And that we all know what that price is. It's going to be Ukraine. So let me put it in very simple terms. The war in Iran is bad news for Ukraine. If you love Ukraine and its ability to defend itself, you cannot like this war. It is a problem for Ukraine from the point of view of ammunition, increasingly in short supply for NATO and United States, including air interceptors. It's a problem in terms of world attention, but it's also a problem in another more important way, I think, which doesn't get discussed much. But United States and its European allies had built a strong moral case against Russia's invasion on Ukraine and its sort of attempt to occupy Ukraine. And that moral case globally received support, and we know that from the UN resolutions. Europeans and the global South have said this is wrong and have voted at the United Nations to condemn Russia's war on Ukraine. Well, you know, if United States attacks another country that was not an imminent threat to it, a country in which it was having nuclear negotiations, and then goes on to assassinate their leader in the first week, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, I think it's very hard to make a moral case against Russia's war on Ukraine. In other words, United States won't be the one that is calling the shots, that is questioning, that is articulating the moral case. So that is, I think, a very troubling aspect. We know that international law has had its own hypocrisies, has had its own double standards, and US kind of has looked the other way during Gaza. But I think this is a different level when you decide that you can designate a country to be a threat, even though it's clearly not an imminent threat, with sort of an open-ended goals, and start a war.
Yeah. You're right. It green lights a lot of things, and it makes for a situation that was already pretty unstable, even more unstable. But look, Asla, there you are. You're in Washington, so I have to ask you, what is the mood there? What are you hearing about how the war is playing out inside Trumpland? Is there a sense that maybe this time Donald Trump has bitten off more than he can chew? You know, he's looking a little tired, a little rattled in his most recent comments. But what are you seeing in Washington?
President Trump cares about two things. One is the markets, of course, and the other is public opinion. There isn't a huge amount of support for this war in the US public, even though media, particularly mainstream media, is pretty much on war footing here when you're talking about CNN and CBS and a lot of the networks. Yes, they question the end game and everything, but when a country is at war, the media toes the line. And so I think that the public opinion might end up changing if there aren't a significant amount of US casualties. It is too early to say that he is in control of the public opinion. Right now, people are struggling to understand why a president who has promised to end forever wars has entered a new war in the Middle East, the very thing he promised not to do. On the other hand, if this wraps up quickly and President Trump can claim some type of victory, he may not end up having a huge price for this. So long as he can keep oil prices in at a certain limit, from prevent them from skyrocketing. And right now, I think that he's at a dangerous moment for sure. Oil prices have started going up significantly. And it's not, you cannot control escalation. Iranians clearly have a strategy to impose costs on the US and on the world economy. They're saying we're going to burn the house down. We're going to burn the neighborhood down if you keep attacking us. And they are also not going to be the first ones to blink. So this is now a game of who will blink first. I get a sense that President Trump might be open to an off-ramp, which is very hard with having killed one supreme leader for reasons that are not clear, and to have his son replacing him and then seek an off-ramp. He's going to have a lot of explaining to do. So it may well be the case that he continues for lack of a better strategy. And that's exactly the type of thing being dragged into a Middle East war that he promised not to do.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we'll see. Taco, Trump always chickens out. Maybe he is blinking. Maybe he isn't. We just don't know. All right. Well, look, let us leave it there. Confusing and dangerous times.
Very dangerous, Bill. There are so many ways this war could spread in Eastern Mediterranean, definitely in the Caucasus, giving Russia or other players an opportunity. We don't know what lessons China is driving from all of this. We just have to, and not to mention the world economy, we just have to hope that things wrap up and the war sort of ends with an off-ramp fairly soon. But I don't think anybody has an answer or a plan.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Asli, for talking for us today. And I know we'll be back talking to you again sometime pretty darn soon.
Thank you, Bill.
My guest today was the Brookings Institution's Aslı Aydıntaşbaş. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering you 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We are following the Iran war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.